Great. So hello to anyone who might be watching. Today I have the honour of interviewing the great Dr Thomas Daffern, a man who I've been staying with here in his house in the centre of France, and it's been a great honour to stay here, and he's a very fascinating man, so I hope you all enjoy listening to this, and it's being directed in particular to the students of Trinity College. So yeah, I hope this will be of benefit. Doctor, thank you for being here.
Right, no, thank you for coming and visiting all the way from Ireland. And you did do a heroic journey to get here, didn't you? You cycled 300 kilometres.
500.
500 kilometres to get
Yes.
here. So I think you deserve an interview after all that.
Thank you.
And you've been helping here for a few weeks now, isn't it?
Nearly 50 days actually.
Gosh, there we are.
Over time, yeah.
So Pentecost is upon us, so this is our interview on Sunday.
Here it is.
Thank you.
Yes.
And you're off soon, aren't you? You're going to Rome.
Yes, I'm going to Italy in a few days, then coming back, and then going back to Ireland.
Right. Good. Okay, so anyway, you've got some questions for me, haven't you?
Yes,
Go
so
for it.
to start the show,
Yeah.
could you please tell us a little bit about who you are and perhaps what kind of work that you do here?
Gosh. I've got many disguises. I mean, I've got about 10 sort of disguises that all are quite important. And you see, if you live long enough, then you spend like a few years doing one thing, a few years doing another. And so I've never been just doing a one thing kind of person. I'm a portfolio person, and actually I have a thing upstairs in one of my rooms, a 9-pointed star. On each of the 9 points I've got a particular thing that I do, you know, just to try and keep track of it all. So the first thing I am as a poet, I discovered poetry in my teenage years. I had very learned parents, amazing woman Ciaran Heussaff and her husband George. They loved poetry. Every Sunday we'd read Shakespeare. They had the collected works of the English Romantic poets, Shelley and Keats, and they had Yeats, and they had also modern European poets like Zbigniew Herbert. And I discovered Wallace Stevens, T.S. Eliot and all that by about the age of 15. Rilke, you know, I was reading at the age of 12. And I just decided I wanted to be a poet because they were the only people telling the truth in society. I felt that the conventional schooling I'd received at Brighton College and Brighton Grammar School was very superficial. It was sort of queen worship with a sprinkling of Christianity that nobody explained properly, and worshipping the system, militarism and war, and you know, I didn't want any of that nonsense. I was a peace activist from the age of 11 when I refused to join the corps at school. So poetry I found was the only thing that really made sense. So I decided to drop out of school and become a poet. And I've stuck faithful to that calling ever since. I've written over 1,000 poems. I've set up an order of peace poets. I've given poetry readings, and I still write. You know, so if on my tombstone you put poet, that's fine. That's enough, right?
Of course.
Okay, that's just one. So then the next thing I am is also a philosopher, because I discovered philosophy a bit later than poetry. I realised that much as I love poetry and it's incredible, one also needs to explain life somehow. What is going on? You know, why are we here? Who are we? Where do we come from? Is there a god or goddess or what? And I discovered there's this thing called philosophy that answers those questions. And I fell in love with Spinoza, I think the first philosopher to make me sit up and go, wow, in his ethics, because he tried to explain reality sort of logically, mathematically. I discovered, God, there's this thing called philosophy. And I fell in love with all the great philosophers, Plato especially, Aristotle. I studied partly at the University of Bristol, doing a philosophy degree, with a great Kantian scholar. And then I studied independently, inspired by Wittgenstein, who was always leaving Cambridge and going off to live in a hut in Norway. So I went off to live in a hut in Canada, and read world philosophy in a way that you couldn't do at university back in those days, because I was insisting on studying all world philosophies, like Buddhist, Eastern, Islamic, Jewish, Christian as well as classical pagan and modern scientific. So I'm also a philosopher, and I've taught that. You know, I graduated eventually and have a teacher's qualification in teaching philosophy.
Very good.
Okay, I'm also a teacher. That's a third thing, which is really important to me. And I qualified, and I've taught in schools for 10 years and universities as well. I love teaching. I'm also so that kind of makes me an academic as well. In my university teaching, I'm also an academic or scholar. I'm also a writer, because I've also written novels and lots of, you know, academic stuff, and a couple of plays. And I think also I need to put the word historian there, because my PhD is in intellectual history. I chose to study history because, as an academic, it's the most broad of the subjects that enable you to study the history of everything. And I'm a polymath, I want to know the history of everything. Everything has a history. So if you look at things with a historical eye, it's like you're not taking sides, you're trying to see everything from both sides, which is really important to me. Okay, and then in addition to all that, I'm also a peace activist, because I believe that's the most important thing on the planet, is to prevent World War III, to prevent nuclear war. I was taken as a boy on CND marches. My parents were a family of peace activists against nuclear weapons. And I just grew up with that. And so I set up Philosophers for Peace in the 1980s. We've been the kind of intellectual arm of the Peace Wing ever since. It's still going. I, you know, run the Institute of Peace Studies and Philosophy from here in France now. So I take the view that as a philosopher stroke peace activist, we should analyse the causes of conflicts, not accept the media idea that war is inevitable, you know, and we're the good guys and they're the bad guys. I mean, that's too simplistic. We need to get to the causes of all this stuff and resolve it. So that's a few of my identities. I'm also an actor. I love theatre. I've written a couple of plays. I used to act, but I chose to go down a different path. But you know, I still think that theatre is a one way of telling the truth. Like, I'm a great lover of theatre and Shakespeare and all that. And a couple of my plays I'd like to see them perform. One's about the end of the world.
Yes.
It has a happy ending.
Mm.
Anyway, there's a little glimpse of some of what I do.
And is it also true that you're a Druid? I heard that somewhere. Could you say anything about that, perhaps?
Okay, yeah, sure. No, that's another one of the stars, isn't it?
Or what is a Druid, perhaps?
What is a Druid, yes. Well, a Druid to me, a Druid is just the Gaelic word or Celtic word or Welsh word for an intellectual. The etymology of the term is really interesting, because it's it comes down to common roots with Sanskrit. So the Dru bit is the same root as the word Dharma, meaning the ultimate truth. In Buddhism, they say the Dharmakaya survives, the Buddha's truth body or Dharmic body. The Dharma is the teaching, so if we share ideas, we're giving out Dharma here. Right? So that's the first bit. The second bit, vid, is to see or know. So a Dharma seer is the literal translation of the word Druid. And of course, when I discovered Druidry, I was in my late teens. I was walking to Stonehenge reading a book called Pagan Celtic Britain by Anne Ross. And it was like a bombshell, because I'd been very drawn to tantric Buddhist stuff, Eastern thought, yoga, already at that age. And then I discovered there were these, we didn't have to go to India to reach enlightenment. We had our Celtic equivalents. And I realised these Druids would have been on the same level as Buddha and the sages of India. They believed in almost the same things: reincarnation, a cycle of lives, truth. They were sworn to non-violence. They practiced the healing arts. They were the scientists of their day. And yet they were never taught in schools. I'd never heard of them. I had to discover them as a private scholar. So I read everything you could about Druids and went off and meditated at Stonehenge and Avebury and these sacred sites. And that began a lifelong fascination with Druids, right? So I've been to Tara many times, and Newgrange and the sacred sites of Ireland. And I believe that as the Tibetan Buddhists, they can plug into termas, which are these like impressed areas in the landscape. I believe the Druids of ancient civilizations have left termas embedded in sacred landscapes, which you can plug into if you go to Karnak or Stonehenge or whatever. And then I eventually wrote an encyclopedia of Druid Studies, getting frustrated at the way it's treated like the ugly duckling of religions.
Yes.
You know, only a few experts in Celtic studies study this thing, although there is a sort of pop culture of Druidry now, quite a few thousand practicing Druids who work through different orders. And I support all that lot. But I'm the scholar end of that. I think that, and I'd like to see a master's degree in Druid Studies set up. So I wrote the encyclopedia of it. There's 3 volumes here. Yeah. And I'm the Peace Druid of Britain. I was given the Peace Sword of Britain here, which is a ceremonial thing at Avebury, which is a great honour to have received. It's got the words of peace on the blade in every different language.
It's a real sword.
It is actually a real sword, made by Wilkinson Swords, who were the sword makers to the British Army, actually, up until fairly recently. It was made for the millennium, so that's why it's a peace sword. And then I moved to Europe here, and I set up the Council of European Druids, which I run. So, yes, Druids are important. And the final thing I want to say about them, which I think is interesting, is in the Gaelic New Testament, which I have a copy of on my bookshelves, when it says baby Jesus was visited by 3 Magi, in the Gaelic it says 3 Druids. So Druid is also a translation of the word magus, or magician. And, you know, so that brings in the whole question of what is magic. And I've written the first book on peace magic in the history of the world, as far as I can see. Because I think that there's so much war magic going on, people misusing their esoteric powers for wrong and harm doing, that we need to balance that with peace magic. And that's what is a peace druid, is what I'm sort of teaching. And I've written a book about that, which people can study.
Very good, very good.
Good.
Because it is true that the Druids have been kind of cloaked in mystery for centuries, really. And we have a general understanding, I think, of historian, of teacher. But of Druids, it's kind of, there's a lot we don't know, I think. Or perhaps, the average human being doesn't know.
Yeah, even average Celtic people aren't really taught in schools. I mean, you went to school in Ireland, didn't you?
I never heard of a Druid.
In an Irish medium school. Seriously, they never taught you about
I never heard of a Druid, not that I can remember anyway,
right.
in my years of education.
Well, not even when you did the Nativity and the baby Jesus. What did they call those 3?
They called them 3 kings.
Right.
3 Ri, and the Irish is, for Druids is 3 Dri. So they might have kind of slipped them into kings deliberately.
I suppose it's more fun for the kids to dress up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or perhaps not. Dressing as Druids would have been fun too.
So yeah, no, there is a lacunae. Although James Joyce knew about Druids, he weaves them into Ulysses in several places.
That's true. Yeah.
And
Mullen and MacLear appear.
Yeah. And the intelligentsia of Ireland obviously know a lot about Druids, and I've based a lot of my research on what they found out. Because of course what's exciting about Ireland is that it was never conquered by the Romans.
No.
And so its indigenous pagan culture, which was Druid-based, was never eradicated. It lived on and transmogrified into Christianity. But a Celtic Christianity, which was much more intelligent, let's call it more Gnostic than the mainstream, imperial Christianity of Constantine. And I'm very interested in the Gnostic roots of Christianity. I've written commentaries on the Gospels, including Mary Magdalene and Jesus and Thomas's Gospel. And I find huge echoes between that and the early Druid poetry of Emergin of Ireland and Taliesin of Britain. There's evidence that Taliesin had heard of the Book of Enoch, which is a very Gnostic kind of text in the Ethiopian Bible, which the Rastas love. So to me, a Druid is simply somebody that is interested in these cosmic currents of truth, Dharma, which transcend religious labels. And in the old days, a Druid could travel from Ireland to Turkey, to Gaul, and be respected by every tribe they passed through. They had like a free pass of non-violence.
Mm.
And they were the mediators and peace bringers of Western Europe, you know.
Mm.
So I say bring them back. We
Bring them
need
back.
them. Because we're run by corrupt politicians who don't tell the truth,
Mm.
you know. Like, why aren't there Druids in the House of Lords to keep tabs on them?
Mm. Mm.
Or in the Senate in Ireland or Wales?
Mm. And I think we'll come back to politics in a later course of the interview.
Sure.
It reminds me about the Celtic Christianity. I have a friend who said that kind of Celtic Christianity was called the Church of Love, whereas the religion of the Roman Catholic Church was called the Church of Law. I wonder what you think of that.
Well, it shouldn't be the case, because the whole point of what St. Paul taught, which is one of the founders of the Roman Catholic Church, was that love supersedes law.
Mm.
And if you actually read St. Paul and the Gospels, that's the whole point of the teaching. That was what Jesus was teaching, was like the spiritual law, the Dharma, transcends the political law of, you know, the emperors, kings and politicians.
Mm.
So, but what's so weird is how it was subverted. By becoming the religion of the empire, it then adopted the means and thought processes of imperial power politics, and then was subverted, you know. But there have always been saints, living saints in the church, sometimes on the fringes, you know, sometimes the heretics. I mean, even Ignatius Loyola, he was always accused of being a heretic, and he had to like always go one step ahead of the posse. All true sages are like that, you know. And so there have always been witnesses to the actual law of love, which is the real teachings of Christ. You know, and you can find them both in the Gnostic marginalised groups, but also even in the mainstream, if you look carefully enough, in my opinion.
Thank you. A question that came to mind when you spoke about being a teacher earlier was, I suppose, your view of education, and seeing as this may be directed to third level students, the role of education and its importance. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that?
Well, you know, it's something I've spent my life. I mean, I was the children of teachers, actually grandchild, because in my family goes back a ways. Education is really, really important, but I mean, and at all levels, you know, from primary school kids learning how to read and write and tell the truth, up to university students trying to study all world religions, you know. It's all the same thing. Education is a birthright, it's a human right. I don't believe it's a business. I don't believe it should be charged for ridiculous fees. I think it should be free as much as possible to every child on the planet, up to and including university level. I think, you know, it should be a grant system that everybody can access it. I believe it's our birthright. The point of education is to spread wisdom and enlightenment. That's the point of teaching. I think one of the mistakes that educational professionals have done is they've agreed to split knowledge up into all kinds of different areas of specialism, and then they generate their own little elites and cabals that specialise in the what of what, you know, and it becomes like diminishing returns, smaller and smaller bits of knowledge. I've always been a rebel against that, which is why I wanted to be a poet rather than a toady of the system, you know.
Yes.
I mean, to me, knowledge is poetry, but as a philosopher and academic, I think we need to reclaim the poetry of knowledge. That's why one of my most important philosophical works is called Being and Knowledge. I've tried to look at what is at the heart of the human enterprise, which is, you know, the search for knowledge and wisdom. And how can we do that? And how can we do that rather than seeking to kill each other? You know, if I'm of one religion and you're of another, instead of me wanting to kill you, we should be celebrating the difference and studying the differences. I'm with Abelard, the Church of Abelard, who was the intellectual that set up the University of Paris. He was in secret correspondence with the Sufis of Andalusia and Spain and the Kabbalists of Spain. And Abelard was saying we should be all in love with each other's wisdom traditions and not argue about who's closer to God. You know, we should be humble and find out the truth, you know. which is why I've done this commentary on the Gospels, but also on the entire Quran. I'm trying to be true to Abelard's vision as an intellectual. Now, to me, that's real education, what we're talking about here. Unfortunately, many universities don't deliver the goods. They just become McBurger's hamburger specialist studies and business, you know. Those aren't universities. What I like about Trinity, and I'm glad you're from Trinity, is it is a proper university still. It's got great scholars. I love the library. It's to die for, you know. And the most important advice I can give to students is to be courageous. Kant said, sapere aude. Dare to be enlightened. If your teachers are mediocre and they're telling you, you can't study that, or you can't do that, that's too big, just, you know, tell them to get lost. I mean, it's your birthright to find enlightenment. So if you want to put together a course which draws on everything, human rights, gender, politics, metaphysics, Druidry, Platonism, you know, whatever, that's your right to follow the whole totality of learning. That's what higher education's about. And it should be the birthright for everybody. So like Kant, I'm a defender of freedom of speech in academia. That's why I help run the World Intellectual Forum. We fight for the rights of intellectuals around the world. People shouldn't be imprisoned for their belief systems. They should be supported to do better research. You know, I mean, with Salman Rushdie, I've just been reading his autobiography, and tragically he was stabbed. There's a case of an intellectual being attacked, you know. I wouldn't have done a fatwa against Rushdie. That was a mistake by the Imam. I would have given him a scholarship to come to Qom and study Islamic theology and philosophy. And you see, Rushdie actually doesn't know much about Islam. He was not properly educated.
No.
And, you know, his autobiography makes this plain. He was educated at Cambridge. The antidote to ignorance is more wisdom. You know, Rushdie himself is on a learning curve. And, you know, so the antidote is never fatwas and violence. It's more knowledge and education.
Listen to this man.
Well, there we are anyway.
Yeah.
Little attempt. Rushdie, get in touch if you watch this.
Yes, and get
we'll
well
chat
soon.
about it.
Get well soon, Rushdie.
And get well, yeah. Oh, and his name, by the way, I've discovered, his father named him after Ibn Rushd, the great philosopher of Cordoba, who's one of my own intellectual heroes, who believed in the importance of reason within Islam. One of the tragedies of latter-day developments in Islam is this idea that you can't be an intellectual and a Muslim, that they're somehow like opposing to each other, and that it's only a matter of faith. No, that's completely not Islamic. Muhammad himself always wanted people to become as learned as possible, to study, to be scholars, to study even as far as China, you know. True Islam is about finding truth. And he was learned enough to know that, even though he wasn't skilled in any higher education, we could call it. He was, you know, he had his own intuitive vision, which is what Carlyle talks about in his essays on Muhammad.
Okay, very good.
Right, go for it. What's your next question?
So I suppose we've kind of touched on, you've briefly mentioned some of your works, the Druid Encyclopedia or Being in Knowledge, but are there perhaps any other works that, I mean, how many are there, and what kind of subjects have you written about, and any particular relevant recommendations for the young people of Ireland perhaps?
Gosh. Well, you should all rush out and get my Encyclopedia of Druid Studies if you're Irish working at Trinity. You need to read this Encyclopedia of Druid Studies because it's the first ever time anyone's bothered.
It's very good.
And I mean, I did it because nobody else has done it. I tend to write the books that nobody else can be bothered with or can do. This is so polymathic, it makes James Joyce look like a trivial scribbler. I mean, it's like, to master Druid Studies, you have to know classics, you have to know archaeology, linguistics, history, textual studies, medieval studies, theology, metaphysics, philosophy, mythology, you know, what is a myth, what is a legend. You have to know about depth psychology, archetypal psychology, what's the symbolism behind the Druid stories, You have to know about the supernatural. What is all this out-of-body journeying they're doing? You know, what are all these occult powers and cities they have? You know, you have to have some knowledge of all of that lot before you can even begin to write about Druid studies. And so I haven't. And then you need a knowledge of all different world religions. So there's chapters in here on, say, Hinduism and Druidry, because we can learn an awful lot about Druidry from Hindu's texts. Because the Rig Veda and the early Hindu scriptures, the rishis are essentially Druids. They're on a spiritual journey. They're using their cities, their powers for the well-being of the community. They're peacemakers. They're teachers. It's what the Druids were doing in ancient Ireland and Wales and Britain. And Gaul here, because I'm speaking from the heartland of old Gaul and its Druid civilization, which was going for thousands of years. So anyway, that's the one they should all rush out and read.
Yes.
And there's all kinds of amazing entries, like the one on Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, who was very important in Ireland. There was a Theosophical Lodge in Dublin,
which Yeats joined for a little while.
Yeats was a member, and so A.E. and many of the great intellectuals of the Irish Renaissance, you know, gave birth to the Irish nation, really, in 1916, when they said, enough of these English oppressors, let's have our people back. Blavatsky was an amazing woman, 1831 to 1891. Died on my birthday, the 8th of May, which they call White Lotus Day. And she spent time studying in Shigatse with disciples of the Panchen Lama.
In Tibet.
In Tibet, in 1860s. And she met people there that became famous in theosophical law as the masters, Moria and Kutumi and these people. They were real people, as revealed in the biography of Blavatsky by Jean Overton Fuller, who was a friend of mine. I met her. Okay. We both spoke at the Theosophical Society History Conference back in the 80s. Jean wrote this incredible biography of Blavatsky, who was born in Ukraine.
Okay.
And she mentions Druids a lot in her works. She says they were the wisdom keepers of the Celtic world, and she ought to know because she travelled around the world, you know, interviewed all the great Sufis and mystics and stuff, and studying in Shigatse, for God's sake. So there's a whole entry on Blavatsky here.
And many more others.
You know, and.
Yes.
So I think this is a work that should endure for a few hundred years. I don't think it'll be superseded for a couple of hundred years, because there's so much there, including all the Irish scholars like Geoffrey Keating, the great historian of Ireland, who managed to get all the legends of ancient Irish history down from the Druid times, before the monastic libraries were destroyed by Cromwell's troops. And Keating himself was killed by one of Cromwell's soldiers who were sort of arriving in Ireland in the name of capitalism, and this sort of mercantilist view that wealth equals knowledge, equals power, equals justification for imperialism, which I don't buy into that nonsense.
No.
You know, for me, the Druid is a sage who's beyond wealth, power, and all those concerns. You know, that's the merchant classes. Well, Sir William Petty, who was in Cromwell's army, became an economist, right? They invented this thing, economics, to kind of like justify their war and imperialism and stuff. Ridiculous. Anyway, so Geoffrey Keating managed to write it all down. And then later we've got Joyce, the great historian of Irish culture, who I mentioned a lot.
Not James Joyce, another Joyce.
No, a savant and a historian and cultural, you know, expert on social history of ancient Ireland, W.P. Joyce, I think he's called. So, you know, and what I'm a bit surprised at is that this stuff isn't common knowledge in Ireland now, in your generation.
No, it's not.
Trinity and places.
Yeah, there probably won't be many listeners who know about these kind of subjects, perhaps.
I wonder if there may be in your classics department, because what I've referenced in this encyclopedia is all the references in classical sources to Druids. I mean, Poseidonius, one of the great philosophers, actually travelled in Gaul and wrote a book about the Celts of Gaul, which was full of Druid stuff. And Pompey was a great fan of Poseidonius, and he was named after Poseidon, who's the equivalent to the sea god Manannán mac Lir, you know. So I've referenced all the classical sources. Cicero knew about the Druids. Even Aristotle mentions them. And Lucian, the great satirist of Syria, he mentions them in a sort of jokey way. because they're always fun for a joke, you know.
Right. Yeah.
And so they were known about in the classical world, and they were greatly respected, revered even. I mean, Caesar had a love-hate thing going with the Druids because he respected them so much that he wanted to kill them all because they were the intellectuals of the Celts. I don't agree with Caesar's desire to exterminate intelligent people. I'm opposed to that. In fact, I learned what that signified when I went to Auschwitz on pilgrimage some years ago, and there's a hut dedicated to the Polish people who died at Auschwitz, because initially it was a camp for Polish officers, and then they discovered lots of them were Jews, so they then started transshipping loads of Jews into Auschwitz. But initially it was a Polish thing. And in the Polish hut there's a photograph of a speech by Himmler, who'd been appointed ruler of Poland.
Really?
And he said in his speech, it was a quote from it, that we're going to totally change the Polish education system. We're not going to teach them anything beyond a bit of writing, bit of mathematics, and that's it. We don't want to teach them to think. We don't want to teach them to be clever or learned, because they'll rebel against us. You know, it's the most incredible speech about using education to dumb down a people. Right. So when I read that, I thought, that's what Caesar was trying to do with the Druids. That's why he was killing off the intellectuals. Because to conquer a people, you kill their intelligent people. But fortunately, he didn't quite succeed.
Yes. Yeah.
They lived on, you know, and Caesar himself is dust.
By the way, perhaps maybe you should clarify when you said you went on pilgrimage to Auschwitz, that it was a pilgrimage for the sake of.
Well, it's a thing one should do in one's life. I mean, I've been to Dachau and other camps, because I did my degree in modern world history, so the Holocaust and World War II and the Cold War. You know, I did my PhD on all this stuff, the horrors of war. So, define pilgrimage. You know, my daughter's doing a PhD at Cambridge on pilgrimage and poetry. What's the Irish term for a pilgrim?
Illyracht is the name for pilgrimage, and a pilgrim is Illira.
And what's the etymology of that?
I don't know, I'm afraid.
Okay.
I just know the word.
Not enough. Yeah, to do the Druid Studies properly, you have to do the etymology, you see, to know what these concepts mean. Another book I've written, which I'd also flag up there for people interested in language, is what's called the Kabbalah Runes.
Okay.
In the Kabbalah Runes, I've done something totally crazy, right? Because I've always been fascinated by the Kabbalah ever since discovering this ancient Jewish tradition. My family were friends with lots of Jewish people, intellectuals in Montreal, where I was born as a kid. And the Jews are very clever people, you know, like, why? What's their secret? I always wanted to know. And some of my mother's best friends were highly intellectual Jewish academics and savants. And I grew up sort of inspired by all this lot. And what was their secret? So many years later I went to Canada and I bought this etymological dictionary of English by Rabbi Klein, K-L-E-I-N, still the best etymological dictionary. And I discovered he also done one on Hebrew. So I taught myself some Hebrew. And I got deeply into the scientific study of Hebrew letters, which is what the Kabbalah comprises. So that when a Kabbalist reads the Hebrew scripture, they analyze each letter in each word, and they boil it down to the primal root sounds of that word. So that text is speaking about the ongoing creative process of God in creating and sustaining the universe. Because